uniquely Slovenian but popular all over Yugoslavia, the band symbolically named Bulldozer, which actually, with its twisted Zappa-like music and absurdist, irreverent lyrics, literally bulldozed the musical terrain for the decisive break that was not yet Laibach, but punk. Okay, at this point, some of you can live for a coffee or cigarette break, because then you know all about Slovenian punk, but the rest maybe will hear something of interest, since the first to write politically and theoretically about punk, well, actually more theoretically than politically, was one Slavoj Žižek, then in a double role as editor of the theoretical and literary magazine Problemi, and as a communist, as he had put it itself at the time. Yeah, but first, let me prolong the suspense and use your attention for a bit of advertising. Under the title Punk Under Slovenians, a short lesson. So, I have to tell you, punk began already in 1977, very early. It perceived itself as more of a parallel culture or counterculture, also within Yugoslav rock, that was always a terrain of a sharp struggle of ideas. Here I'm quoting Slavoj Žižek, who wrote an endorsement of the Škud Student Cultural Center drive to obtain the license to release the Sex Pistols' first album. That was late 1979. It never happened, but anyway. And another difference: Slovenian punk has become popular and later a key part of alternative culture, while in most other Yugoslav urban centers it mutated into more populistic or arty new wave, ska, and other non-political forms. I think this can mostly be said also for the Western punk music, with the exception maybe to rock against racism or similar marginal phenomena. But this didn't mean that it was underground or marginal, or as many people thought, even like well-meaning people later on. Quite the opposite. If it were not so massive and public, it would never have had the effect it did, and the reaction from the system that it provoked. The other important feature was its DIY, do-it-yourself mode of production, and especially ideological, and I would say also theoretical autonomy, also from the sympathetic outside theory, except in the special situations which I will mention. Yes, and of course, the independence from youth organization and the noise controls of the system. And another important difference, this was made possible, yes, by two remains of the Red Decade, to paraphrase Alain Badiou, of student movement. These two remains were Škud Students Cultural Center, which has been, I think, frequently mentioned here. But I'd like to stress the special importance of an earlier reminder of the student movement day. That was Radio Student. Now, by now, of course, it's high time for me to cite, for your pleasure, Slavoj Žižek and his editorial in the punk issue of the mentioned leftist theoretical literary magazine Problemi in 1981. It went like this, partially. When we encounter a point that has symptomatic value, we above all let the symptom speak for itself and not understand it in advance, this way reducing it to what is already known. End of quote. The editor also stated punk literally enacts the suppressed dimension of the normal and is already in that liberating, introducing a certain estranging distance. It is precisely the absence of explicit future perspective that indicates that punk is already speaking to us from a certain utopic, non-alienated place. End of quote. So this was kind of a psychoanalytic endorsement of punk, one could say, a defense, but also a defense of the speaker's position himself, I think. So, what was the noise, subversion, or let's say politics of punk? Maybe I should mention here that Laibach considered punk from the beginning and for a very long time. Of course, not by Laibach itself, but by all sorts of outside forces. So, what did the symptom that Zizek spoke about? To cut a long story short, it was the politics of truth, to somewhat superficially appropriate Foucault and also the rabbi from Nazareth and another Jesus James Angleton. You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Or in Laibach and NSK native language, Wahrheit macht frei. But the alternative systemic condition for this subversion to become popular and relevant was an independent electronic medium. Here I will quote a certain neglected Marxist Hans Magnus Enzensberger. Capitalism alone benefits from the left's antagonism to the media, and it does as it does from the depolitization of the counterculture. End of quote. This is from his essay on consciousness industry, written in mid-70s. Actually, part of it was published in Problemi. But it was also recently published online. So, radio student, yes. What was so special and unique about it? It was its autonomy. This was not due only to the hardly controllable nature of the medium, which could not be censored like the press can be, but also because of its financial autonomy, achieved by exploring the advertising needs of the socialist market economy. And it also enabled musical programs of Students' Cultural Center to self-finance, and also many other things. That was and still is one of the differences also between Laibach and more artistic or civic, let's say, parts of the then alternative culture. But especially important for the relationship between punk and then Laibach, as noises, so to speak, and alternative culture, were not only the challenges to the system, noise music control, but also to the alternative ones. First, Punkerty named their second album, self-ironically, State Lovers, which was defined as state rock at Radio Student and deemed musically not to be quite punk anymore. Laibach did it at its first totalitarian confrontation with a massive punk audience at Novi Rock, at the festival Novi Rock 82. That was the time when the Nazi punk scandal was still very present in everybody's mind, and then already also in the face of the alternative culture defense strategy after the Nazi punk scandal. Namely, Laibach Kunst did not publish its conceptual manifest, The Covenant, 10 points of the Covenant, under the title Action in the Name of an Idea, let's say in Problemi, or Radio Student, or even magazine, more massive magazine, Weekly Mladina, that has been awakening at the time, but in a non-leftist publication, which was Nova Revia. That was considered bourgeois dissident, not only by the regime, but also by part of the alternative theoreticians. This assertion of autonomy has much later caused some amusing misunderstanding between the Laibach, NSK, and alternative theory, of which one protagonist I have mentioned before. But the most important part of Laibach defection to Nova Revia, so to say, was an essay under the heading Totalitarianism by Taras Kermauner. It was rediscovered relatively late, and he noticed that Laibach Kunst is trying to, I'm quoting, break out of the imprisonment of just text literature, which is the imprisonment and desocialization of the 70s. By this, have Laibach appropriated the role of ideology? They disclose, unveil it as totalitarian, and the conscious appropriation of bondage as freedom. When Leibachians are overly and undesirably hyper-regime, they radicalize the totalitarianism of Nazi Stalinism as the supreme value of the power authority as such. As the unveilers of the regime, they become anti-regime and outside regime. So, yeah, there was not all the theory of Leibach in the theoretical sources that we know and very well estimate, but also on the other side of the divide of the social civic society, so to speak. So the interesting thing is that the proposal to publish this Leibach Covenant in Neue came from Leibach themselves, but it was totally under control. The editors didn't have any possibility of interfering. On the other hand, that was the time where the Nazi punk scandal was still very much alive. Actually, Leibach produced one of their own not much later. Still, there are no indications of the direct influence of the scandal on the evolution of Leibach Kunst into its new phase. It is known, though, that a new member, later the protagonist of its new totalitarian image and performance, has dealt with it in an interview. And yes, actually, the first concert by Leibach in Ljubljana happened soon after the outbreak of the Nazi punk scandal, while the first totalitarian performance was actually at the marginal festival of international leftist musical franchise Rock in Opposition. Anyway, the new idea of popular music, as articulated by Leibach Kunst, was unacceptable even for much of the new punk audience. Especially relevant for NSK was the effect of the performance on the new generation of avant-garde artists, among them at least two of the later founder members of NSK, as they, I think, recognized themselves. So, to come back to the formation of Leibach, as this Nova Revia Covenant and their poems and so on were published before the Nazi Leibach scandal, and as Leibach Kunst itself decided on this move, as I said, we can surmise that the above essay was kind of fed back in what they did. And then came the unexpected subversion and provocation, since it represented the distancing by Leibach Kunst from the punk context, as I mentioned. It happened at the very serious institution, Zagreb International Musical Biennale. And yes, it represented the distancing by Leibach Kunst from punk context itself. This action in the name of an idea was very much punk, actually. Iconoclastic, irreverent, not at all hyper-regime, or to use a Žižekian term, over-identification. But Leibach's famous national TV interview, where Leibach was to be punished for the Zagreb iconoclasm of Tito, was so successful that their name was then officially banned. And by provoking a mass moral outrage and public calls for repression, that was also maybe a moment of truth of the civil society that was already being a bit fetishized by alternative culture. Namely, Taras Kermauer has put it like this in Nova Revia: Leibachians unveil the rotten compromise that is commonplace today and which doesn't mean freedom but corruption. That it is possible to unite the primordial, elementary personal freedom with the belonging to society or its parts, classes, parties, groups. Leibachians have, albeit with a Brechtian paradox, done that which today's middle classes, sweetening themselves and self-deceiving themselves with bourgeoisie ideologies from recent past, don't dare. They told outright how things are in reality and not in programs. That which humanism ideologically attacks, but at the same time practices most actively, the technical, scientific, non-free society, Leibach Kunst, de facto unmasks. Totalitarian is precisely the majority unproblematic conviction of its self-deceiving that it is personal and free, but it is really only private, servile, and non-binding. So these words of a bourgeois theorist, so to speak, sound, to me at least, very relevant today, in a nominally completely different political system and society. In this sense, maybe only in this sense, it could be claimed that Leibach NSK criticized capitalism in the 80s, inasmuch the mainstream civil society was again becoming capitalist. Another connected myth of the alternative 80s, which I have to mention briefly, is the benevolent, even protective role towards Leibachians and NSK of the official youth organization. Well, the fact is that this organization came into being as part of the above-mentioned clampdown on the liberal factions within the Communist Party and also the student movement that happened in the late 60s and early 70s. So the Union of Socialist Youth has begun officially to change its controlling and repressive attitude only years later, after the explosion of punk movement and then Leibach Kunst and NSK. All of this is documented in two books, which you may know, Punk Under Slovenians and Punk Came Earlier, which Dr. Močnik has mentioned. And of course also in the Leibach NSK literature. There was censorship in encouragement of self-censorship from the start, from the side of the youth organization, and until mid-80s. It did not prevent the Nazi punk scandal in 81, a very bad repression against the punk, not the beginning of the banning of Leibach name in 83. On the other hand, it did support Novi Rok, the festival which made punk and also Leibach popular, but only from 84, and enabled the publishing of the Punk Under Slovenia's book in 1985, and then demanded Leibach's legalization in 1986. But by then, the alternative culture and movement, as some call it, has become practically mainstream with strong public support, as documented by historian Božo Repe. And I'm quoting him here. Slovenians in the 80s, that is the title of his book, and he says, by 1986, the popularity of alternative movements was close to its zenith. More than 75% of public opinion poll answers knew them, and more than 45% were prepared to collaborate with them. So, since NSK came into being in 1984, the same year of the What is Alternative Symposium, that kind of canonized and defended alternative culture, it could be said that it was at the same time the apex of the alternative culture and also the harbinger of its normalization. I remember being quite distressed, even outraged, by the exhibition Irvin Leibach in Škuc, which was Marina Gržinić was very much involved in that. It appeared to me, if not quite the aestheticization of Leibach politics, then at least the aestheticization of Leibach's subversive politicization of aesthetics. But then I understood that it was actually Leibach that was politicizing the art of Irvin. The same occurred about the baptism under the Triglav, the mega production of Sister Scipion Nasice theater. It seems to me a total anathema for NSK to go into a dominant cultural political center where party congresses were held. But seeing and hearing it with forbidden Laibach name and music and its frontman on stage changed my mind. Not to mention that it was a great theater performance. So, in my view, the essence of Laibach-NSK relationship with alternative culture and mainstream institutions was its repeated reaffirmation of its autonomy and the political aesthetic of the truth, and its challenges not only to the system, but to the alternative culture, as it was developed already into an ideology, a kind of generalization, and it was through social movements, by the nature of things, ever closer to the youth political subsystem. Well, the rest is history. Laibach Kunst and later NSK action in the name of idea has had its role in the momentous changes of history in this part of the world. What this role is can be a contention, but the role was there. The crisis of the best of all worlds seems to me at least to indicate that those changes were not actually for the better. But Laibach Kunst and NSK's rather unique and place time-specific role in these events also seems not to preclude the universal emancipatory non-alienation and utopic potential of an alternative creation of noise, if I stay with this dictum, disturbance in the musical arts and modes, and hence in the system of the really existing vice of the total global society of spectacle and market normalization as preemptive counterculture. And now a short postscriptum. I hope I'm not exceeding my time too much. And of course, on the topic of NSK Irvin constructing a new national cultural identity, which I seem to have understood Dr. Mochnik previously. Well, not to be too complex about it. In the 80s, I think they were actually, in my opinion, deconstructing it, if not worse, as Laibach regularly did with a little help then and later by Peter Mlakar, director of the Division of Pure and Practical Philosophy of NSK, and his speeches, which was also Laibach's speeches, and Belgrade, which where as you may know, he actually asked the Serbs, why is Serbia so small? That was the high time of Milosevic. Then in Vienna, where Peter Mlakar, on behalf of Laibach and NSK, which was there at the Wiener Festwoche, told the Austrians that they were Germans, and also for its anti-nationalistic provocations. And then at the first Slovenian New State Pomp and Circumstance event that they were actually invited to, I think it was the only one. That was the grand opening of the European Month of Culture in 1997, where Laibach music clashed with National Philharmonic, and Peter Mlakar's speech produced a major scandal. He was half naked and dressed in a butcher's apron and stuff like that. Not to mention the Hakenkreuzes of Hartfield that were circling on the diplomatic corps in Slovenia. The Archbishop stood up and went out and stuff like that. I don't know, maybe this is also banal or constructing new national identity, but maybe not. So, Taras Karmaura, I come back to him again, has put it back then. Laibachians barbarically intrude from outside, as strangers in the Slovenian home, shaming it in order to purify it. Okay, this is a bit strange, but anyway. So, and now what's going on? Now they're going to North Korea, as you may have read. Well, my first instinct was to invoke the old Sex Pistols line, cheap holiday in other people's misery. But I've learned not to trust my first instincts. Like asking, why is there no more Licht, so to speak, at this exhibition, you know, maybe a light show of sorts, maybe some loud music, and so on. But then I remembered the fascist light show overkill of the last Eurosong, and well, yes, I must not trust my first instincts. Or answering the question, what to do? That probably won't be asked, at least not of me. You may ask this Dr. Moshnik, someone else of that caliber, but I don't expect it. But anyway, when deciding what of these past achievements or failures are relevant for you today, so when faced with the ages-old dilemma between the child and the dirty water, I say unto you, ditch the child and save the dirty water. Thank you.